Some say Sherlock Holmes sees what no one else can. A footprint, a smudge of ash, a word unsaid, and suddenly the whole mystery unfolds. With Dr. Watson by his side, no case is ever too strange, no clue too small. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Hurry. Isn't it remarkable how these stories connect us, no matter where we are in the world? Let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from, and do you ever beat Holmes to the solution? Let's begin. Chapter 1. Frozen Secrets. The winter of 1889 was one of particular severity in London, with bitter winds sweeping down from the north and snow piling in drifts against the buildings of Baker Street. It was during this harsh season that my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, became involved in what I consider to be one of his most remarkable cases. A case that, like the Arctic itself, concealed beneath its frozen surface depths of human deception and danger that I shudder to recall even now. We had been sitting quietly in our rooms at 221B Baker Street on a particularly frigid evening in late January. The fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows upon the walls, while outside the windows, snowflakes swirled in the yellow glow of the gas lamps. Holmes had been in one of his contemplative moods for several days, alternating between lying motionless upon the sofa and energetically sawing at his violin. That evening, however, he had settled into his armchair with his pipe and a curious monograph on the variations of ash from different types of tobacco, while I was engaged with a recent medical journal. "My dear Watson," said Holmes suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had enveloped us, "would you not agree that there is something peculiarly fascinating about the polar regions? Those vast unexplored expanses of ice where a man might lose himself not only geographically, but morally as well." I looked up from my reading with mild surprise. "I cannot say I have given it much thought, Holmes, though I imagine the conditions would test any man's character to its limits." "Indeed." Holmes tamped down the tobacco in his pipe thoughtfully. "When civilization is stripped away by the cruel hand of nature, what remains is the essential man, sometimes noble, sometimes quite the opposite." Before I could respond to this philosophical observation, we were interrupted by the sound of our bell, rung with such force that Mrs. Hudson was prompted to answer it with unusual haste. Moments later, we heard her ascending the stairs, accompanied by a heavier, more labored tread. "A visitor, Holmes," I remarked, "and in some distress by the sound of it." "Yes, and recently returned from a considerable journey under trying circumstances," Holmes replied, sitting straighter in his chair. "This may prove of interest." The door opened to reveal our landlady, her face bearing an expression of concern. "Dr. Sutherland to see you, Mr. Holmes. I've told him you aren't receiving visitors at this hour, but he insists the matter cannot wait." Behind her stood a tall, gaunt figure of a man, his face weather-beaten and marked with what I immediately recognized as the unmistakable signs of frostbite. His clothing, though of good quality, hung loosely upon his frame, suggesting recent and significant weight loss. Despite the warmth of our rooms, he shivered visibly, his eyes darting nervously from Holmes to myself. "Pray, show him in, Mrs. Hudson," said Holmes, rising to his feet. "The doctor has clearly travelled far and undergone considerable hardship to consult us." As our visitor stepped into the light, I was struck by the haunted quality of his gaze. His beard, which appeared to have been hastily trimmed after a period of unchecked growth, was streaked with grey, despite his relatively young age, which I estimated to be no more than 40 years. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "I am he," my friend replied, "and this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, before whom you may speak as freely as before myself. Please, take a seat by the fire. You are still suffering from the effects of extreme cold, unless I am much mistaken." Our visitor sank gratefully into the chair Holmes indicated. "How did you know I had been exposed to extreme cold? Though I suppose the frostbite makes it obvious enough." "That, and several other indications," Holmes replied. "The particular weathering of your skin suggests exposure to both intense cold and reflected sunlight off ice or snow. The calluses on your hands are consistent with those of a man accustomed to handling scientific instruments while wearing gloves. There is a faint stain of silver nitrate on your right index finger, commonly used in photographic processes under difficult field conditions. Taking these observations together with your general physical condition, I would venture that you have recently returned from an Arctic expedition, the Hyperborean, I believe, given the recent reports of its troubled return. Dr. Sutherland stared at Holmes in astonishment. You are absolutely correct, Mr. Holmes. I am, or rather was, the ship's physician on the Hyperborean Arctic expedition. But how could you possibly know the specific expedition? Holmes waved his hand dismissively. The newspapers have made brief mention of the expedition's return, though with frustratingly few details. Your timing makes it the obvious conclusion. But pray, tell us what brings you here on such an inclement night, when you should by rights be recovering from your ordeal. Sutherland leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly before him. Mr. Holmes, I come to you because a great injustice is being covered up. Captain Edward Parry, our expedition leader, did not die by accident, as the Admiralty has declared. He was murdered, sir, murdered in the most remote and desolate place on earth, and I believe the murderer walked back to civilization amongst us. Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. You have evidence of this? Not evidence that would satisfy a court of law, Sutherland admitted, but enough to convince any reasonable man that something sinister occurred. The official story is that Captain Parry wandered from his tent during a blizzard and succumbed to the elements. A tragic accident, but not unprecedented in Arctic exploration. Yet there are facts that do not align with this explanation. Such as, Holmes prompted, leaning back and steepling his fingers beneath his chin. Captain Parry was an experienced polar explorer, Mr. Holmes. He would never have left his tent during a storm without his compass, yet it was missing from his effects. The pages from his journal covering the week before his death had been torn out, and there were strange footprints near his body that did not match any of the expedition members' boots. Sutherland reached into his coat and produced a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. I managed to salvage a fragment of his journal, a peculiar rock specimen he had been studying, and a damaged photograph of our expedition party. The Admiralty has shown no interest in these items, being content, indeed, oddly determined, to label his death an unfortunate accident. Holmes accepted the items, examining each with his characteristic intensity. And why have you brought this matter to me rather than to the authorities? Because the authorities are part of the problem, Mr. Holmes. The Admiralty is pressuring all survivors to sign statements confirming an accidental death. Those who hesitate find themselves subtly threatened with ruination of their reputations and careers. There is something larger at work here, something they wish to keep hidden. Sutherland's voice dropped to a near whisper. Captain Parry discovered something in the Arctic, Mr. Holmes, something that some powerful people would kill to possess or to keep secret. Holmes carefully turned the pages of the journal fragment, his keen eyes scanning the entries. Suddenly, he paused, holding one page up to the lamplight and examining the binding with his magnifying glass. Watson, he said quietly, I believe we may need to postpone our plans for a quiet winter by the fire. There appears to be a coded message hidden in the binding of this journal, one that Captain Parry took great pains to conceal. He looked up at our visitor, his expression grave. Dr. Sutherland, I shall take your case, but I must warn you, if your suspicions are correct, you may have placed yourself in considerable danger by coming here tonight. As Holmes spoke these words, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows of our lodgings, and the light in the room seemed to dim momentarily, casting long shadows across the floor. In that moment, I felt a premonition of the perilous path upon which we were about to embark, a path that would lead us into the darkest secrets brought back from the frozen north. Chapter 2. The Captain's Log. I had seldom seen Sherlock Holmes so intently absorbed in a problem as he was with the curious fragments brought to us by Dr. Sutherland. After our visitor had departed, having first secured lodgings at my insistence in a small hotel where he might be less conspicuous than at his club, Holmes spent the remainder of the evening hunched over Captain Parry's journal fragment, examining it under various lenses, and even, at one point, holding it over the chemical lamp which he used for his more delicate experiments. What do you make of it, Holmes? I inquired, as the clock upon our mantelpiece chimed midnight. It is most singular, Watson, he replied, without looking up. Captain Parry was evidently a methodical man, precise in his observations and economical in his use of words, qualities one would expect in a naval officer entrusted with such an expedition. Yet in these final entries, there is a distinct change in his handwriting, suggesting increasing anxiety or perhaps haste. Holmes handed me the journal, indicating several passages. Even to my untrained eye, the once neat script had become more hurried. the letters more compressed, as if the writer feared he might not have time to record all that needed recording. "But it is what is not here that interests me most," Holmes continued, taking up the magnifying glass once more. "The missing pages and this." He indicated what appeared to be a series of tiny indentations along the binding, barely visible to the naked eye. "Morse code," I ventured. "No, Watson, a simple substitution cipher, but cleverly concealed." Captain Parry pressed his message into the binding using a fine-pointed instrument, perhaps the tip of a compass, knowing that even if the pages were removed, this hidden message might survive. Holmes worked through the night, his keen eyes and nimble fingers extracting meaning from what seemed to me nothing more than random marks. By morning, pale winter sunlight found him still at his task, though now with several sheets of paper covered in his precise handwriting scattered about him. "I have it, Watson," he exclaimed at last, his voice betraying the excitement he always felt when unraveling a particularly knotty problem. "Listen to this. Suspect deliberate sabotage. Graves and Fleming not what they seem. Discovered deposit at coordinates." And here it breaks off, Watson. The good captain was unable to complete his message. Sabotage? Then his suspicions align with those of Dr. Sutherland. Indeed. And these names, Graves and Fleming, they must be members of the expedition. We must learn more about them. Holmes rose and stretched his lean frame. "I believe a visit to the Admiralty is in order. They will have the official records of the expedition." After a hasty breakfast, we set forth into the bitter cold of the London morning. The streets were treacherously icy, and a thin mist hung in the air, transforming the familiar landscape of the city into something alien and forbidding. It seemed an appropriate backdrop for the grim tale that was gradually unfolding before us. At the Admiralty, we were received with the cool efficiency characteristic of that institution. Upon Holmes presenting his card, we were shown into a waiting room where the naval prints upon the walls told tales of British maritime glory. We had not been waiting long when the door opened to admit a tall, distinguished gentleman whose bearing immediately suggested a lifelong career at sea. "Admiral Sir George Hampton," he introduced himself, eyeing us with what I took to be a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "I understand you wish to inquire about the Hyperborean expedition, Mr. Holmes. May I ask in what capacity?" "I have been engaged to look into certain aspects of Captain Parry's death," Holmes replied, straightforwardly. "Dr. Sutherland has expressed concerns that it may not have been the simple accident described in the official reports." The Admiral's expression hardened. "Dr. Sutherland is suffering from the after effects of extreme conditions and prolonged isolation. His concerns, while understandable, are without foundation. The case is closed, Mr. Holmes." "Nevertheless, I should like to examine the official records of the expedition," Holmes persisted. "For the sake of thoroughness, you understand." For a moment, I thought the Admiral would refuse outright, but after a brief internal struggle, visible in the tightening of his jaw, he nodded curtly. "Very well. But I warn you, Mr. Holmes, you are wasting your time, and I would advise against spreading unfounded rumors about one of His Majesty's naval expeditions. Such actions could be considered unpatriotic." We were led to a small Spartan office where a clerk produced several bound volumes containing the official documents relating to the Hyperborean expedition. As Holmes began to leaf through them, I observed over his shoulder that they appeared remarkably sparse for such a significant undertaking. "These records have been edited," Holmes murmured, too quietly for anyone but myself to hear. "Notice the gaps in the pagination, Watson. Entire sections have been removed." Nevertheless, Holmes proceeded methodically, making occasional notes in his pocketbook. After an hour of this, he closed the final volume with a thoughtful expression. "We must speak with Lord Blackwood," he announced, as we emerged once more into the chill air of Whitehall. According to these records, he was the expedition's primary financial backer. His address is given as Blackwood House, Mayfair. Lord Blackwood proved to be a robust man of about 60, with the florid complexion of one who enjoys the pleasures of the table, and a directness of manner that suggested considerable self-assurance. He received us in a sumptuously appointed study, the walls of which were adorned with hunting trophies and maps showing various expeditions into remote corners of the globe. "Of course I backed Parry's expedition," he declared, after Holmes had explained our interest. "A sound investment, despite the unfortunate outcome. British presence in the Arctic is vital to our national interests." I was under the impression it was primarily a scientific expedition, Holmes remarked mildly. Lord Blackwood waved a dismissive hand. Science, exploration, national prestige, these things go hand in hand, Mr. Holmes, but I fail to see what this has to do with poor Parry's death. A tragic accident, nothing more. You seem most eager to consider the matter closed, Holmes observed. Wouldn't any reasonable man be? What purpose is served by dwelling on a tragedy? Blackwood's face flushed a deeper red. Besides, the survivors have suffered enough without being subjected to needless questioning about an event they would sooner forget. As we took our leave, Holmes paused to examine a framed ship's manifest hanging in the hallway. Most interesting, he murmured. The expedition carried an unusual quantity of blasting powder for a scientific venture, wouldn't you say, Watson? That evening, as we sat before our fire once more, Holmes smoked his pipe in contemplative silence while I reflected on what we had learned. There is more to this expedition than appears on the surface, Watson, he said at length. According to the manifest, I observed at Lord Blackwood's residence 2 members of the Hyperborean crew, a quartermaster named Harrison and a carpenter named Doyle, had previously served on the ill-fated Franklin expedition. Franklin, I exclaimed. But that was years ago, and didn't all hands perish? Not quite all, Holmes replied grimly. A handful survived by resorting to measures too terrible to contemplate. The Admiralty has kept the full story from the public, but rumors of cannibalism have persisted. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night outside our windows. Surely you don't suggest? I suggest nothing at present, Holmes interrupted. I merely collect facts. And here is another. The expedition was not merely scientific in nature. They were searching for mineral deposits of strategic importance, likely the deposit mentioned in Parry's coded message. Holmes was about to elaborate further when we were startled by the sound of breaking glass from his bedroom. In an instant, he was on his feet, rushing toward the source of the disturbance with myself close behind. As we burst into the room, we caught a glimpse of a dark figure disappearing through the shattered window onto the fire escape beyond. The journal fragment, Holmes exclaimed, hurrying to the drawer where he had secured it. To our relief, it remained untouched, our intruder having been interrupted before completing his mission. We must act quickly, Watson, Holmes declared, his grey eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. It seems we have stirred a nest of hornets with our inquiries today. Tomorrow we shall seek out Professor Fleming, the expedition's geologist. If Parry's suspicions are correct, he may hold the key to this increasingly complex puzzle. As we secured the broken window as best we could against the winter night, I could not help but reflect that we had ventured onto thin ice indeed, and beneath it lurked depths of darkness and danger we had only begun to fathom. Chapter 3. Icebound Deception. The following morning dawned grey and forbidding, with a dense fog that crept through the streets of London like a living entity, muffling sounds and transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly silhouettes. Holmes was up and dressed before I had stirred, his restless energy having apparently precluded much sleep. "We have much to accomplish today, Watson," he announced as I joined him at the breakfast table. "I have dispatched inquiries regarding Professor Alistair Fleming's whereabouts. Since returning from the Arctic, he has apparently secluded himself at a small property in Hampstead." "Do you suspect him of being involved in Captain Parry's death?" I asked, helping myself to toast and coffee. "I suspect nothing and everyone at this stage," Holmes replied, his keen eyes fixed on the morning newspaper. "But I find it significant that one of the names mentioned in Parry's hidden message belongs to the expedition's geologist, a man who would have particular interest in any mineral deposits discovered during their journey." Holmes tossed aside the newspaper and took up the strange crystalline rock that Dr. Sutherland had brought us. He turned it over in his long fingers, examining it from various angles. "Have you noticed anything unusual about this specimen, Watson?" he asked. I took it from him and examined it closely. "It appears to be some form of quartz, though I confess I am no expert in mineralogy." "Observe its weight," Holmes prompted. "It is considerably heavier than it should be for its size. And note the unusual blue luminescence visible in its depths." Before I could respond, there was a knock at our door, and Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a telegram. "Just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, handing him the yellow envelope. Holmes tore it open and scanned its contents, his expression growing grave. "It seems Professor Fleming is expecting us," he said, passing me the telegram. "He wishes us to call upon him this afternoon." Most curious, as I had not yet informed him of our interest. Word of our inquiries must have reached him, I suggested. Indeed, and that suggests communications more efficient than the postal service. Holmes rose from the table. Come, Watson, we have time before our appointment to make another call. I wish to learn more about Lieutenant Victor Graves, the other man named in Parry's message. At the Naval Club in Pall Mall, Holmes's reputation granted us an interview with Rear Admiral Thornton, who had served with Graves on a previous commission. Graves, the Rear Admiral echoed, when Holmes inquired. Capable officer, steady hand, not the sort one notices particularly, which in the Navy is often a compliment. Was there anything unusual about his selection for the Hyperborean expedition? Holmes pressed. The Rear Admiral's weathered face remained impassive, but I detected a slight hesitation before he answered. Not that I recall, though I believe he had spent some time attached to our embassy in St. Petersburg prior to the voyage. His experience with cold climates may have been a factor. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. One final question, if I may. Was Lieutenant Graves particularly interested in geology or mineralogy? At this, a flicker of surprise crossed the Admiral's features. As a matter of fact, he was. Quite the amateur enthusiast, as I understand it, collected specimens wherever he was posted. Why do you ask? Merely establishing a complete picture, Holmes replied smoothly. Thank you for your time, Admiral. As we made our way to Hampstead through the clinging fog, Holmes was unusually silent, lost in thought. Our hansom eventually deposited us before a modest cottage set back from the road, its garden overgrown and neglected, the windows shuttered despite the early hour. Our geologist appears to value his privacy, I remarked as we approached the door. Or fears what may be outside, Holmes replied enigmatically. Our knock was answered by a thin, nervous-looking man with a wild growth of beard and eyes that darted constantly, as if seeking hidden threats. Despite the chill, he wore only a dressing gown over his clothes, and his hands trembled visibly. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Please, come in quickly. The interior of the cottage was in a state of considerable disarray, with books, papers, and geological specimens scattered across every surface. Maps of the Arctic regions were pinned to the walls, marked with annotations in a cramped hand. The air was close and stale, suggesting the windows had not been opened in some time. You must forgive the state of my quarters, Fleming said, clearing books from 2 chairs to allow us to sit. I have been preoccupied since my return. With your analysis of specimens collected during the expedition, Holmes inquired mildly, his gaze sweeping the room and no doubt recording every detail. Fleming's reaction was immediate and alarming. He sprang to his feet, his face contorted with fear. Who told you? Was it Graves? Or Blackwood? They've been watching me, you know, waiting for me to reveal what I know. Holmes raised a calming hand. No one has told me anything, Professor. I am merely making a logical deduction based on your profession and the purpose of the expedition. Fleming sank back into his chair, visibly struggling to compose himself. Yes, of course. Forgive me. The Arctic, it changes a man. The isolation, the constant darkness of the polar winter. It preys upon the mind. Is that what happened to Captain Parry? Holmes asked quietly. Did the isolation affect his judgment? Parry, Fleming gave a hollow laugh. Parry was the sanest of us all. Too sane, too perceptive. That was his undoing. You speak as if his death was not accidental, I observed. Fleming's eyes widened and he leaned forward urgently. You know, don't you? That's why you're here. Sutherland must have told you. Holmes produced the crystalline rock from his pocket and held it up to the weak light filtering through the shuttered windows. I know that this is no ordinary mineral specimen. I would value your professional assessment, Professor. For a moment, Fleming stared at the rock as if mesmerized, then abruptly snatched it from Holmes's hand. Where did you get this? He demanded. It was among the items Dr. Sutherland salvaged, Holmes replied. He believed it to be of significance. Significance? Fleming whispered, turning the specimen over in his trembling hands. Mr. Holmes, this rock represents a discovery that could transform the balance of naval power in Europe. It is an entirely unknown mineral with extraordinary properties. When subjected to the electrical influence of the aurora borealis, it generates a field that can disrupt compass readings and, potentially, disable the electrical systems that modern warships increasingly rely upon. And Captain Parry discovered a deposit of this mineral? I asked, beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. Fleming nodded. A massive vein embedded in a cliff face on a previously uncharted island. Parry charted its exact location but kept it secret from most of the crew. Only he, myself, and one or two others knew the precise coordinates. Including Lieutenant Graves, Holmes suggested. Fleming's face darkened. Graves was not supposed to know, but he had ways of obtaining information. Parry suspected he was reporting to another government, the Russians most likely, given his time in St. Petersburg. Petersburg. When Parry confronted him, he trailed off, his gaze distant. That was when the accident occurred, Holmes finished for him. I cannot say for certain what happened that night, Fleming replied carefully. I was at the base camp, while Parry had established an observation post nearer to the deposit site. But I know he intended to destroy his notes and charts rather than allow the location to fall into the wrong hands. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the intensity I had often seen when a case began to crystallize in his remarkable mind. And yet, someone wished those notes and charts to survive, someone who tore pages from his journal but missed the hidden message. Fleming nodded miserably. The stakes are enormous, Mr. Holmes. Control of this mineral could determine the outcome of any future naval conflict. As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused to examine the damaged photograph that had been among Dr. Sutherland's items. This picture has been deliberately altered, he remarked. A figure has been carefully excised from the group. Fleming peered at it and nodded. Yes, that would have been Eriksson, our Norwegian guide. He disappeared during a blizzard 3 days before Parry's death. At least, that was the official explanation. You doubt it? I heard Parry and Eriksson arguing the night before he vanished. Something about indigenous legends regarding the island where we found a mineral deposit. Eriksson was refusing to return there, claiming it was taboo. As our hansom carried us back through the fog-bound streets of London, Holmes was deep in thought, his brow furrowed in concentration. A complex web indeed, Watson, he said at length. A valuable mineral deposit, a foreign agent, superstitious fears, and at the center of it all, a man willing to sacrifice a significant discovery for what he perceived as the greater good. He was interrupted by a boy who ran alongside our cab, waving frantically. Holmes rapped on the roof for the driver to stop, and the lad handed up a hastily scrawled note. It's from Wiggins of my Baker Street Irregulars, Holmes explained as he read it. Dr. Sutherland has been found unconscious in his hotel room, apparently poisoned. Holmes's face grew grim as he tucked the note into his pocket. The game grows more dangerous by the hour, Watson. Someone is determined to silence everyone who knows the location of Parry's discovery, and now they know we are investigating. As our cab resumed its journey with increased urgency, I reflected that the frozen wastes of the Arctic had extended their deadly influence into the very heart of London, threatening to claim more victims before this case reached its conclusion. Chapter 4. The Northern Witness. We found Dr. Sutherland lying pale and still upon his hotel bed, attended by a local physician who had been hastily summoned by the hotel management. The room bore signs of having been searched, though whether before or after the poisoning was impossible to determine. Belladonna, if I am not mistaken, Holmes remarked, after examining the remnants of tea in a cup on the bedside table. He lifted the victim's eyelids gently, revealing widely dilated pupils, administered in sufficient quantity to render him unconscious, but not, I think, to kill. Our adversary wishes to incapacitate rather than murder, at least for the moment. Will he recover? I asked, my medical instincts roused. With proper care, yes, replied the attending physician, who introduced himself as Dr. Anstruther. Though I confess I would not have identified the poison so readily as your friend has done, Doctor. Watson. I arranged for Sutherland to be moved to a private nursing home where he could be both properly treated and protected from further attempts upon his person. As we left the hotel, Holmes' expression was one of grim determination. Our investigation has stirred a nest of vipers, Watson, he said, as we walked briskly through streets now shrouded in the early darkness of a winter afternoon. The poisoning of Dr. Sutherland confirms that someone is most anxious to prevent the truth about Captain Parry's death from emerging. But who? I asked. Fleming seemed genuinely frightened, hardly the demeanor of a man orchestrating these attacks. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, And yet the poison used on Sutherland suggests a knowledge of Arctic flora. According to my monograph on exotic poisons, there is a plant found only in the polar regions whose berries produce effects remarkably similar to those of belladonna, though more difficult to trace in the bloodstream. Then our poisoner was almost certainly a member of the expedition, I concluded. Precisely, and that narrows our field considerably. Holmes hailed a passing cab. To King's Cross Station, driver, and with all possible haste. Where are we going? I asked, as we settled into the hansom. To Hull, Watson. There is another witness we must interview, one who may provide a perspective on these events that we have not yet considered. The journey to Hull was long and uncomfortable, the train compartment inadequately heated against the bitter cold that seemed to permeate the very walls. Holmes sat in silence for much of the journey, his eyes closed, though I knew from experience that his mind was far from inactive. Only as we approached our destination did he rouse himself to speak. I have been considering the damaged photograph, Watson, he said, producing it from his pocket. The missing figure, this Erickson that Fleming mentioned, troubles me. Why remove him specifically? Perhaps because he disappeared before Parry's death, I suggested. To eliminate questions about his fate. Possibly. Or perhaps because he saw or knew something that threatened our adversary's plans. Holmes tucked the photograph away as the train began to slow. In any case, I hope our next interview may shed some light on this aspect of the mystery. Hull greeted us with a biting wind that swept in from the North Sea, carrying with it the pungent odors of fish and tar that characterized this busy port. After securing rooms at a modest inn near the docks, Holmes led the way through a maze of narrow streets to a tavern frequented by whalers and other mariners who plied the northern waters. The establishment was crowded and noisy, filled with the rough speech of men who spent months at sea. Holmes moved through the throng with the ease of one who has frequented such places before, his keen eyes scanning the faces until they settled on a solitary figure seated in a corner. The man was unmistakably an Inuit, his broad, weathered face bearing the distinctive features of his people. He was dressed in the rough garb of a sailor, but around his neck hung an amulet of carved bone that seemed out of place with his otherwise Western attire. "Nanook?" Holmes inquired, approaching the table. The man looked up, surprise and wariness flashing across his features. "Who asks?" he replied in accented but clear English. "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are investigating the death of Captain Edward Parry of the Hyperborean expedition." A shadow passed across Nanook's face at the mention of the expedition. He gestured for us to sit, glancing around as if to ensure we were not overheard. "You are not from the Admiralty," he stated, rather than asked. "No," Holmes confirmed. "We represent Dr. Sutherland, who believes there was more to the captain's death than has been officially acknowledged." Nanook nodded slowly, a flicker of what might have been approval in his dark eyes. "The doctor is a good man. He treated my people with respect when others did not." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I left the expedition before the captain's death. They say I abandoned my duty, but I had reasons." "Those reasons are precisely what we have come to discuss," Holmes said. "Dr. Sutherland mentioned you were the expedition's guide." "Yes, I know the northern waters, the ice, the signs of weather. My father and his father before him taught me how to read the land where there is no land. Only ice and darkness." Nanook's gaze became distant. "But there are places even my people do not go. Sacred places. Cursed places." "Like the island where Captain Parry discovered the mineral deposit," Holmes suggested. Nanook's eyes widened slightly. "You know of this?" "Yes, that island. In our stories it is called Torngat, the place of spirits. It is forbidden to go there, especially when the sky dances with light." "The aurora borealis," I murmured. "Yes. When the skylights dance, the stones of Torngat wake. Strange things happen to those who carry them away. Compasses spin, metal grows hot without fire, men's thoughts become confused." Nanook touched the bone amulet at his neck, as if for protection. "Captain Parry did not believe the old stories. He ordered us to land on Torngat, to dig." "And that is when you decided to leave the expedition?" Holmes prompted. Nanook shook his head. "Not then. I stayed, though my heart was troubled. It was later, when I saw the evil spirits among the crew." "Evil spirits," I repeated, exchanging a glance with Holmes. Men changed after we visited the island, whispers in the dark, watching each other with hungry eyes. The stones they took, they changed those who kept them close. I saw Lieutenant Graves speaking to shadows when he thought no one was near. And the Norwegian, Eriksson, he began to fear his own footsteps. Tell us about Eriksson, Holmes said, his interest visibly sharpened. He disappeared before Captain Parry's death, I believe. Yes. Nanook's voice dropped even lower. Eriksson knew the old stories. Similar tales exist among the Norse who settled Greenland. He wanted to return the stones to the island to make peace with the spirits. He and the captain argued. The next day, Eriksson was gone. Gone, Holmes repeated. Not dead? The others said he wandered out in a blizzard, that his body was never found, but I saw footprints leading away from the camp that night. More than one set of footprints. Nanook's gaze was steady. I left the next morning before the darkness in men's hearts could claim another victim. Did you report your suspicions to anyone? I asked. Who would listen to an Inuit's stories of evil spirits? Nanook replied with a bitter smile. I told Sutherland some of what I knew, but not all. He is a man of science. He would seek physical explanations. And yet, Holmes remarked, there may be a scientific explanation for what you observed. Professor Fleming has identified the stone from the island as a mineral with unusual properties, particularly when exposed to the electromagnetic phenomena of the aurora borealis. Nanook nodded slowly. Perhaps your science and my people's stories speak of the same truth in different tongues. Did you observe anything else unusual before you left? Holmes asked. Anything that might help us understand what happened to Captain Parry? Nanook was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. 3 nights before I left, when the skylights were strong, I saw strange lights on the ice, not from above, but moving across the ground near where the stones had been stored, like blue fire, but cold. And I heard the stones singing. I might have dismissed such an account as superstition had I not already heard Professor Fleming's description of the mineral's unusual properties. Holmes, too, seemed to take the statement seriously. One final question, he said. Did you notice any particular relationship between Captain Parry and any other member of the expedition? Anyone he trusted especially, or conversely, anyone he seemed to distrust? The captain kept his own counsel much of the time, Nanook replied, but he watched Lieutenant Graves closely in the days before I left, and he spoke often with Dr. Sutherland. I believe he trusted the doctor. As we took our leave of the tavern, the wind had grown even fiercer, driving icy particles that stung the exposed skin of our faces. We had nearly reached our inn when Holmes suddenly seized my arm, pulling me into a shadowed doorway. We are being followed, Watson, he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. A man in a sailor's peacoat has been tracking us since we left Nanook. Peering cautiously around the edge of the doorway, I caught a glimpse of a burly figure pausing at a street corner, his face obscured by the upturned collar of his coat. What now? I asked, my hand instinctively moving toward the revolver in my pocket. We continue to our inn as if we had noticed nothing, Holmes replied, but remain alert. Our adversary grows bolder. We had not gone more than 50 yards when there came a whistling sound through the air. Holmes cried out a warning, pulling me roughly aside as a harpoon embedded itself in the wooden door just behind where I'd been standing. In an instant, Holmes was in pursuit of our attacker, who had emerged from a narrow alley with surprising speed for a man of his bulk. I followed as best I could, my military training serving me well as we navigated the labyrinthine streets of the port. The chase ended abruptly at the edge of a wharf, where our assailant, finding himself cornered, turned to face us. In the dim light of a nearby gas lamp, I could see that he was indeed a sailor. His weather-beaten face contorted with a mixture of fear and determination. It's over, Holmes said firmly, advancing slowly. Who sent you? Was it Graves or Lord Blackwood? For a moment, the man hesitated, as if considering his options. Then, with a sudden movement, he turned and leapt into the dark waters of the harbour. Holmes rushed to the edge, peering into the blackness below. He'll not survive long in these temperatures, he remarked grimly. The cold will claim him before he can swim to safety. Despite our efforts to alert the harbour authorities, no trace of our attacker was found that night. As we sat before the meagre fire in our inn room, Holmes smoked his pipe in contemplative silence. We have stirred dangerous waters, Watson, he said at length. The attempt on our lives confirms that we are on the right track. Nanook's testimony, combined with what we learned from Fleming, suggests a conspiracy extending far beyond a simple murder. We must return to London tomorrow and speak with the remaining survivors of the expedition before they too fall victim to our unseen adversary. As I retired to bed that night, the wind howling outside our window like the spirits Nanook had described, I could not shake the feeling that the icy tendrils of this case were tightening around us, drawing us inexorably toward a confrontation as dangerous as the frozen wasteland where it had begun. Chapter 5. Tracks in the Snow. Our return journey to London was accomplished without further incident, though Holmes maintained a vigilant watch throughout, convinced that our movements were being observed. Upon our arrival at Baker Street, we found a telegram waiting from Dr. Anstruther, informing us that Dr. Sutherland's condition had improved marginally, though he remained unable to communicate. Our first priority must be to locate the remaining survivors of the expedition, Holmes declared, consulting a list he had compiled from the Admiralty records. They are scattered across Britain, some perhaps intentionally hiding themselves away. The attack in Hull confirms that someone is desperate to prevent us from reconstructing the events in the Arctic. Surely the Admiralty would have records of their whereabouts, I suggested. Holmes shook his head. The Admiralty has been less than forthcoming, Watson. No, we must employ other methods. He reached for his hat and coat. I shall visit my brother Mycroft at the Diogenes Club. His position in government may afford him access to information denied to ordinary mortals. By evening, Holmes had returned with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. Commander William Forsyth, he announced, the Hyperborean's first mate, has retired to a small estate near Inverness. According to Mycroft's sources, he has become something of a recluse since the expedition's return. Then we are bound for Scotland, I asked, already mentally preparing for another journey. Indeed, Watson. The night train leaves in 2 hours. I suggest you pack warmly. The Scottish Highlands in winter can be nearly as forbidding as the Arctic itself. The journey north was long and tedious, the train's progress frequently impeded by snowdrifts upon the line. It was late afternoon of the following day when we finally reached the small village nearest to Forsyth's estate, where we engaged a local trap to convey us the remaining distance. Glenmoriston House stood in splendid isolation among snow-covered hills, a solid stone structure that seemed to grow from the ancient landscape itself. As our conveyance approached along the winding drive, I noted that while the grounds appeared well maintained, there was an air of neglect about the house itself. Shutters closed despite the early hour, chimneys producing only the thinnest wisps of smoke. Our ring at the door was answered by an elderly manservant whose rheumy eyes regarded us with undisguised suspicion. Commander Forsyth receives no visitors, he informed us in a thick Highland accent, making to close the door. Holmes's foot deftly prevented this. I think he will receive us, he said firmly, presenting his card. Please inform him that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson have come from London specifically to consult him on a matter of grave importance concerning the Hyperborean expedition. At the mention of the expedition, the old man's expression changed subtly. He hesitated, then reluctantly bade us enter, showing us into a dimly lit drawing room before departing to inform his master of our arrival. The room bore the hallmarks of a seafaring man, a ship in a bottle upon the mantelpiece, nautical charts framed upon the walls, a sextant displayed under glass. But it was the layer of dust upon many of these objects that spoke most eloquently of their owner's state of mind. He has abandoned his former interests, Holmes murmured, examining the room with his characteristic attention to detail. Note the books on the shelf, Watson, recently rearranged, with works on polar exploration, now hidden behind volumes of poetry and philosophy. Our Commander Forsyth wishes to forget his Arctic experiences. We were interrupted by the entrance of a tall, gaunt figure. Commander William Forsyth might once have been an imposing physical specimen, but now he moved with the careful gait of a man much older than his years. His face was deeply lined, his complexion pallid, but his eyes remained sharp and wary as they assessed us. Mr. Holmes, he said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a naval officer despite his evident physical decline. I cannot imagine what brings you to my door, but I assure you I have nothing to contribute to whatever investigation brings you to Scotland. I believe you do, Commander, Holmes replied evenly. We are looking into the circumstances of Captain Parry's death, which appears to have been no accident. Forsyth's reaction was immediate. A tightening of his jaw, a brief closing of his eyes as if in pain. That matter is closed, sir. The Admiralty's finding was clear. And yet, Holmes continued, men connected to the expedition continue to face danger. Dr. Sutherland has been poisoned, Professor Fleming lives in terror, and Watson and I narrowly escaped an attempt on our lives in Hull. At the mention of Fleming, Forsyth's expression changed subtly. Fleming is alive, he asked, in a tone suggesting he had believed otherwise. Very much so, though living as a virtual hermit. Holmes fixed Forsyth with a penetrating gaze. Commander, we know about the mineral deposit discovered on the island the Inuit call Torngat. We know of its unusual properties and of Captain Parry's determination to keep its location secret. What we do not yet fully understand is who killed him to obtain that information and who continues to eliminate those who might reveal the truth. For a long moment, Forsyth stood motionless, seemingly engaged in an internal struggle. Then, with a sigh of resignation, he gestured for us to sit. I have tried to forget, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, to push the memories of that accursed place from my mind. But they haunt my dreams still, the lights upon the ice, the stones that sang in the darkness, the madness that crept into men's minds. Tell us what you know of Captain Parry's death, Holmes prompted gently. Forsyth settled heavily into a chair, passing a trembling hand across his brow. I was not present when it happened. Parry had established a separate camp nearer to the deposit site, taking only Graves and the Norwegian, Eriksson, with him. When Eriksson disappeared, Parry sent for me to replace him. His voice faltered. I arrived to find Parry already dead, frozen in his tent. Graves claimed he had wandered out in a blizzard, disoriented after days of exposure to the mineral's influence. You did not believe him? Holmes asked. I had no reason not to, at first, but later, when I helped gather Parry's effects, I found this. Forsyth rose and crossed to a small escritoire, unlocking a drawer with a key he wore around his neck. From it, he withdrew a folded paper, yellowed and worn at the creases. A partial map, torn from Parry's journal. I concealed it rather than turning it over with his other effects. I could not say why at the time. Instinct, perhaps. Holmes accepted the map with barely concealed eagerness, studying it intently. This shows the island, but not the exact location of the deposit, he observed. The complete map was in the pages torn from his journal, Forsyth confirmed. This was merely an overview of the region, with the island marked. And yet even this would be valuable to someone seeking the deposit, Holmes mused. Have you shown this to anyone else? Forsyth hesitated. Lord Blackwood has been in correspondence since our return. He suggested that any materials related to the expedition's discoveries would be of interest to him, for the proper compensation, of course. And Lieutenant Graves, have you had contact with him as well? A shadow crossed Forsyth's weathered features. Graves visited once, shortly after our return. He asked specifically if I had retained any maps or notes from the expedition. When I denied having any, he became agitated, suggested that my memory might be faulty due to exposure to the mineral, that perhaps I had forgotten conversations with Parry about the deposit's location. Holmes's eyes narrowed. An interesting suggestion. Did you have such conversations? Parry confided in me partially, Forsyth admitted. Not the exact coordinates, but enough that, combined with this map and my knowledge of the region, I could narrow the search area considerably. As Forsyth spoke, a telegram was delivered, which Holmes quickly scanned. Another expedition survivor has been found dead, he announced gravely. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Miller, apparently succumbed to heart failure at his London club yesterday evening. Heart failure? Forsyth repeated, his face paling further. Miller had the constitution of an ox. Precisely, Holmes said. I suspect our adversary is systematically eliminating everyone who might possess knowledge of the deposit's location. He fixed Forsyth with a serious gaze. You are in grave danger, Commander. Whoever is behind these deaths clearly believes that each survivor might hold a piece of the puzzle. What do you suggest, Mr. Holmes? A trap, Holmes replied, a glint of excitement in his eyes. I shall announce through certain channels that I have reconstructed the complete map showing the deposit's location. Our killer, eager to obtain it and eliminate the final obstacle to claiming the mineral, will have no choice but to come after me directly. A dangerous game, I cautioned, but a necessary one, Watson. Holmes carefully folded the partial map and secured it in his pocket. Commander Forsyth, I strongly advise you to leave this isolated location. You are too vulnerable here. As we took our leave, the afternoon light was already fading, the Scottish winter asserting its dominance over the landscape. Our trap had scarcely proceeded a mile down the drive when Holmes suddenly signaled the driver to stop. "Look there, Watson," he said quietly, pointing to the snow beside the road. "Fresh tracks, made since our arrival. Someone has been watching the house, and by extension, us." The imprints were partially obscured by fresh snowfall, but clear enough to discern they had been made by a man's boot, distinctive in its pattern. "Military issue," Holmes noted. "Our adversary becomes increasingly careless, or increasingly desperate." He glanced back toward Glenmoriston House, now a dark silhouette against the gathering dusk. "I fear we may have placed Commander Forsyth in immediate peril by our visit." "Should we return?" I asked, my hand moving toward my revolver. Holmes considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Our presence might precipitate an attack rather than prevent it. Better to proceed with our plan to draw the villain out on ground of our choosing." He tapped the driver's shoulder. "Carry on, and with all possible speed." As our conveyance continued its journey through the snowy landscape, I could not help but feel that we were being observed by unseen eyes, that somewhere in the white wilderness around us, a deadly predator was tracking our movements, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Chapter 6. Thaw of Truth. Upon our return to London, Holmes moved with decisive purpose. Telegrams were dispatched, advertisements placed in select newspapers, and whispers strategically planted through his network of informants, all suggesting that he had successfully reconstructed the complete map to the mineral deposit. Within 48 hours, he had arranged for a gathering at the Royal Geographical Society, ostensibly to deliver a lecture on recent discoveries in polar exploration. "Is this wise, Holmes?" I asked as we prepared for the event. "You are deliberately placing yourself in the path of a determined killer. The wisest course when hunting a predator, Watson, is sometimes to present oneself as prey," he replied, checking his revolver before slipping it into his pocket. "But prey with teeth, you understand. Besides, I have taken certain precautions." The evening of the lecture arrived, cold and clear, the stars visible in the winter sky above London like distant ice crystals. The Society's elegant rooms were illuminated by gaslight, casting a warm glow over the assembled audience. A curious mixture of scientific gentlemen, naval officers, and several figures I recognized from our investigation. Lord Blackwood occupied a prominent position in the front row, his robust frame and florid complexion contrasting sharply with the pallid, nervous countenance of Professor Fleming, seated several places away. Dr. Sutherland, still weak but recovered enough to attend, nodded to us from his wheelchair near the entrance. Commander Forsyth, having heeded Holmes's advice to leave Scotland, stood unobtrusively near a side door. And there, toward the back of the room, Lieutenant Victor Graves surveyed the gathering with the calculated detachment of a military man assessing a tactical situation. Holmes moved to the podium with the confident air that always characterized his public appearances, though I alone perhaps noticed the alert watchfulness beneath his composed exterior. "Distinguished guests," he began, "we are gathered to discuss one of the most remarkable discoveries of recent polar exploration, a discovery that cost Captain Edward Parry his life and continues to claim victims among those who shared his final expedition." A murmur ran through the audience. This was not the dry scientific discourse many had anticipated. "The Hyperborean expedition," Holmes continued, "undertaken ostensibly for scientific purposes, was in fact a search for a mineral deposit of extraordinary strategic importance, a mineral whose properties, when exposed to the electromagnetic influence of the aurora borealis, can disrupt navigational instruments and potentially disable the electrical systems increasingly vital to modern naval warfare." Lord Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Lieutenant Graves remained perfectly still, only his eyes moving as they assessed possible exits. "Captain Parry discovered this mineral on an uncharted island in the far north, an island considered taboo by the indigenous peoples of the region. Recognizing its strategic importance and fearing its potential for disrupting the balance of naval power, he determined to keep its exact location secret, even from most members of his own expedition." Holmes produced a folded paper from his pocket, the partial map provided by Commander Forsyth. This fragment of Captain Parry's original chart, combined with the coded message he concealed in his journal binding and the testimonies of expedition survivors, has enabled me to reconstruct the complete location of the deposit. The tension in the room was palpable now. I positioned myself where I could observe the reactions of our primary suspects. Blackwood's face had darkened, his fingers drumming impatiently upon his knee. Graves maintained his mask of indifference, though I noted a slight narrowing of his eyes. Captain Parry's death was no accident, Holmes declared. He was murdered by someone who sought to obtain this information, someone who has subsequently eliminated or attempted to eliminate anyone else who might possess pieces of the puzzle. The killer's mistake was in assuming that the secret died with Parry and his surviving confidants. With methodical precision, Holmes began to reconstruct the events in the Arctic, using the pointer from the lecturer's stand to indicate positions on a large map of the polar region projected onto a screen behind him. Captain Parry established a secondary camp near the deposit site, taking with him only Eriksson, the Norwegian guide, and Lieutenant Graves. When Eriksson, disturbed by indigenous legends about the island, threatened to alert the rest of the expedition to the potential dangers, he was silenced, not by becoming lost in a blizzard as officially reported, but through more direct means. A gasp rose from several audience members. Graves's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his coat pocket. Parry, witnessing or deducing this act, realized the full dimensions of the conspiracy. He encoded a final message, removed the precise coordinates from his journal, and prepared to destroy all evidence of the deposit's location rather than allow it to fall into hands he no longer trusted. Holmes paused, his gaze sweeping the room before settling with deliberate emphasis on Professor Fleming. But he was discovered in this act by the expedition's geologist, Professor Alistair Fleming, who had formed a secret alliance with agents of a foreign power interested in obtaining the mineral for military purposes. At this accusation, Fleming leapt to his feet, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and fear. "Lies!" he shouted. "It was Graves who killed Parry. Graves who was reporting to the Russians." Graves was on his feet in an instant, his military bearing giving way to barely controlled fury. "Fleming is the traitor. He killed Parry when the captain discovered his correspondence with foreign agents." The room erupted into chaos as the two men confronted each other, their mutual accusations filling the air. Holmes allowed the tumult to continue for several moments before raising his hand for silence. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the disorder, "you are both correct and both culpable. This was never the work of a single traitor, but a conspiracy." The room fell silent as Holmes continued, his deductions unfolding with inexorable logic. Lieutenant Graves was indeed secretly communicating with Russian interests, while Professor Fleming had established contact with German agents. Each believed himself to be the only traitor aboard the expedition. Each saw in the mineral a chance for personal enrichment and advancement. But neither of you killed Captain Parry. A confused murmur ran through the audience. Holmes's eyes moved to the front row. "The honor of that distinction belongs to neither of you, but to the expedition's primary sponsor, Lord Blackwood." All eyes turned to Blackwood, who had risen from his seat, his face a mask of indignation. "This is outrageous, Holmes. You go too far." "Do I?" Holmes replied calmly. "It was you who arranged for both Graves and Fleming to be part of the expedition, knowing their respective foreign contacts made them susceptible to manipulation. You who financed the venture not out of scientific interest or even patriotism, but with the intention of controlling the mineral deposit yourself, selling access to the highest bidder among the European powers, playing them against each other while maintaining Britain's official ignorance of the discovery." Blackwood's bluster gave way to a cold, calculating expression. "You cannot prove any of this." "But I can," came a voice from the doorway. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard entered, accompanied by several constables. "We have intercepted communications between Lord Blackwood and agents of no fewer than 3 foreign governments. And Dr. Sutherland's testimony regarding the events in the Arctic provides further evidence." Blackwood's composure cracked. With surprising agility for a man of his bulk, he lunged toward a side exit, only to find his path blocked by Commander Forsyth. In a desperate move, Blackwood drew a concealed pistol. "The map, Holmes," he demanded, training the weapon on my friend. "Hand it over, and perhaps some of you may leave this room alive." Holmes appeared unperturbed. "The map is already in the hands of my brother Mycroft at the Foreign Office, Lord Blackwood. Your schemes are at an end." With a cry of rage, Blackwood turned his weapon toward Commander Forsyth. I reached for my own revolver, but before either of us could act, Blackwood was tackled from behind by the unlikely figure of Professor Fleming. "Enough death," Fleming gasped as they struggled. "I will not have more blood on my hands." The pistol discharged in the struggle, the bullet harmlessly embedding itself in the ceiling. Within moments, Lestrade's men had subdued Blackwood, Fleming, and Graves, leading them away in handcuffs as the astonished audience looked on. As the room gradually emptied, Holmes, Lestrade, and I remained, joined by Dr. Sutherland and Commander Forsyth. "A most satisfactory conclusion," Holmes remarked, lighting his pipe. "Three conspirators apprehended, each having betrayed not only their country, but each other in their greed." "But what of the mineral deposit?" Sutherland asked. "Its location remains a secret known only to a few." "And so it shall remain," Holmes replied firmly. "The partial map provided by Commander Forsyth, combined with his knowledge of the region, is sufficient to allow the Admiralty to locate the island should it become necessary. But Perry was right. Such power is perhaps best left undisturbed." "The Admiralty may not agree," Forsyth observed. "They will when presented with the full facts by my brother," Holmes assured him. "Some discoveries, like some secrets, are best left buried beneath the ice." Later that evening, as Holmes and I sat before our fire at Baker Street, he reflected on the case with the philosophical air that often came over him after a successful investigation. "It is a curious feature of human nature, Watson, that the most inhospitable regions of our planet often bring forth the most inhospitable qualities in men. The Arctic, with its vast emptiness and brutal conditions, merely provided the stage upon which the darker aspects of ambition and greed played out their inevitable drama." "At least justice has been served," I remarked. "Justice, yes," Holmes agreed, though a shadow crossed his features. "But at what cost? Captain Parry, Erickson, and several other expedition members dead, lives and reputations destroyed, all for control of a mineral that might have transformed warfare, or might have remained safely unknown had the expedition never ventured to that forbidden island." He tamped down the tobacco in his pipe, watching the smoke curl upward. "Perhaps there are some frontiers, Watson, that mankind is not yet ready to cross, some mysteries that, for the present at least, are better left enshrouded in ice and darkness." Outside our window, snow had begun to fall once more, soft flakes drifting past the gaslight like distant memories of the Arctic wastes where our strange case had begun, and where, perhaps, some secrets would remain forever locked in the frozen silence of the North.